A gilded evening in Tokyo, and Nia Hart is being cornered in front of half of Asia's wealthiest elite by the man who once broke her heart. Trevor Lawson stands there with that same smirk she spent 3 years trying to forget, pointing at her bare left hand like it's evidence of something shameful. The crowd watches. Someone laughs. Nia's jaw tightens, and she prepares to take the hit alone, until a hand settles at the small of her back, warm and unmistakable, and a voice cuts through the entire ballroom like a blade through silk. She is my wife. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow this channel to find out just how far this story travels. Stay until the very end. You will not want to miss what comes next. The dress had been a mistake. Nia knew at the moment she stepped out of the cab and felt the October wind cut straight through the thin black fabric, cold enough to raise goosebumps along her arms, even before she reached the entrance of the Aoyama Grand Hall. She'd bought it 6 months ago on a weekend trip to Shibuya, back when she was feeling something close to optimistic, back when the idea of attending a charity gala for the Tanaka Foundation felt like an opportunity instead of an obligation. Now, standing at the base of those marble steps, with her clutch pressed tight against her ribs and her heels already pinching her left foot, she felt none of that optimism. Just the cold, and the noise spilling out from the open doors above, and the familiar low-grade dread she'd been carrying in her stomach since Monday morning when she'd seen the guest list. She hadn't told anyone about Trevor. Not her colleague Jian, not her supervisor at the translation firm, not the handful of acquaintances she'd gathered in the 2 years since she'd moved to Tokyo to build something that was finally, quietly, hers. There hadn't seemed to be a reason to explain it. The relationship was old history. She'd survived it. She'd moved on. She'd crossed an ocean and built a new version of herself out of long work hours and Japanese grammar drills and late nights walking the streets of Shimokitazawa alone, and she'd told herself that was enough. She climbed the steps. The hall smelled of money. That specific blend of imported flowers, expensive cologne, and something underneath it all that was cleaner than anything ordinary. Chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the vaulted ceiling, scattering light across the polished floor in patterns that shifted every time a cluster of guests moved through them. Waitstaff moved between the crowds with practiced ease, carrying trays of champagne flutes and small plates of food that probably cost more per bite than Nia's monthly grocery bill. The guests themselves were exactly the type she'd expected. Japanese corporate executives, foreign diplomats, a smattering of European fashion figures, and the kind of international businessmen who wore their wealth so naturally it seemed like a second skin. Nia took a glass of water from a passing tray and positioned herself near the edge of the room, close enough to the wall that she could observe without being immediately observable. It was a skill she'd developed early, the ability to become background. She was good at it. Good at reading rooms, at picking up on tone and intention before a single word was spoken, at making herself useful without making herself visible. It was, she supposed, part of what made her a good translator. You learned to disappear so that the language could move through you cleanly. She spotted Jian across the room, laughing at something a man in a gray suit was saying, and felt a small knot of relief. She wouldn't be entirely alone tonight. Then she heard the laugh. It was specific enough that she recognized it before she turned around. That particular quality, slightly too loud, slightly too pleased with itself, designed to carry. She'd spent 18 months learning the architecture of that laugh, where it appeared, what it meant, how to brace for what came after. She turned. Trevor Lawson was standing 20 feet away, drink in hand, surrounded by 4 people who were all giving him their full attention. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe he was just wearing better shoes. His suit was dark and immaculate. His smile was the same one she'd fallen for at 24, at a conference in Chicago, when she'd been young enough to mistake confidence for character. He hadn't seen her yet. She had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to move. She didn't move fast enough. His eyes swept the room in that habitual way he had, always cataloging, always scanning for the next useful face. And then they landed on her, and she watched the recognition travel across his expression in stages. Surprise first, then something she couldn't quite name, and then, unmistakably, amusement. He said something to the people around him and began moving toward her. Nia held her water glass and told herself to breathe. Nia Hart. He said her name like it was a punchline he'd been saving. In Tokyo. I didn't know you were in Tokyo. Trevor. She kept her voice level, professional. The The voice she used in conference rooms when she needed to translate something difficult without letting her own reactions bleed into it. I didn't know you'd be here. Tanaka Foundation runs one of the biggest anti-trafficking initiatives in Southeast Asia, he said, with that particular tone he used when he wanted to remind you he knew things. Our firm has been partnered with them for 2 years. I've been coming to this gala every October. He tilted his head slightly. You? I work with the translation services team. We've handled their multilingual communications for the past 18 months. Right. He nodded, looking her over in a way that was just slow enough to be deliberate. You moved here. I did. How long? 2 years. Alone? She felt the word land the way he'd intended it to, like a small, clean punch. She said nothing. Trevor glanced at her left hand, specifically at her ring finger, and the smile that crossed his face then was different from the first one. Smaller, sharper, the kind that meant he thought he understood something. Still alone, he said. It wasn't a question. Around them, the ambient noise of the gala continued unchanged, but Nia was acutely aware of the 3 people who had drifted closer in Trevor's wake, still within earshot, champagne flutes in hand. One of them was a woman she vaguely recognized from a previous Tanaka event, someone in international finance, well-connected, the type who cataloged social information the way other people collected art. I'm doing well, Trevor. Thanks for asking, Nia said, dry enough that there was no mistaking it. He laughed, that same laugh. You haven't changed. People generally don't in 2 years. No, I mean, he gestured vaguely at her, at the room, at the space she occupied. Still doing the solitary thing. I remember you always said you wanted to get out of Chicago, get somewhere new, build something independent. He raised his glass slightly. Seems like you got the independence part. The woman in finance laughed quietly at something. Not at Nia, exactly, but in that direction. Nia felt the heat rise to the back of her neck and kept her face completely still. What happened to that guy you were seeing after we broke up? Trevor continued. The one from the architecture firm? I don't remember who you're talking about. Sure you do. Tall, white. You brought him to Maya's birthday thing. He paused. Didn't last long either, huh? The people around him weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. Nia took a slow breath. She knew this maneuver. Trevor had always been expert at this particular brand of social violence. The kind that looked like casual conversation to outside observers, while landing precisely where it was meant to land. He did it with a kind of ease that suggested he didn't even have to think about it anymore. It was just how he operated in rooms like this, establishing hierarchy, reminding people of their debts. She was deciding how to end the conversation, calmly, without making a scene, the way she always managed these things, when she felt it. A hand at the small of her back. Not a brush, not accidental. A deliberate, steady pressure through the thin fabric of her dress, firm and calm, like something being claimed. Every nerve in her body fired at once. She turned her head slowly. The man standing beside her was not someone she had met before tonight, but something about the stillness he moved with suggested that he was someone most people in this room would recognize without needing an introduction. He was Korean, somewhere in his mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal suit so precisely fitted it looked architectural. His face was angular and composed, the kind of face that revealed nothing because it had been trained to reveal nothing, every muscle held in a deliberate arrangement that communicated calm without warmth. His eyes, when they moved to Trevor, were the specific dark that reminded Nia of water at great depth, no bottom visible from the surface. I wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Trevor with an expression of such absolute, measured attention that Trevor had gone slightly still. I wasn't aware, the man said, in English that carried only the faintest trace of an accent, each word placed with the unhurried precision of someone who never felt the need to rush, that anyone was speaking to my wife. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Not just between the 4 of them, but in a radius that rippled outward, nearby conversations dropping off, heads turning, the ambient hum of the gala dimming in the immediate vicinity as though someone had turned a dial. Trevor's eyes moved from the man to Nia. Wife? Nia did not confirm. She did not deny. She kept her face perfectly still and directed her gaze straight ahead, and she did not let a single thing show, not the shock, not the confusion, not the way her heart had just lurched sideways in her chest. The man beside her did not look at her for confirmation. He simply kept his attention on Trevor with that same patient, unreadable expression, and waited. Trevor laughed, shorter this time, less assured. Nia, you're married? She is, the man said, before Nia could decide how to respond. He said it quietly, factually, the way someone confirms something that is not interesting because it is simply true. The woman in finance had gone very still. The two men who'd been flanking Trevor were now looking somewhere else entirely, suddenly interested in other areas of the room. Trevor looked at Nia with something that might have been genuine surprise if she hadn't known him well enough to see the edge beneath it. You never... This is not a conversation that interests me, the man beside her said, still unhurried, still quiet. Enjoy your evening. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a gesture. He simply turned, and his hand at Nia's back applied the gentlest, most certain pressure, and she found herself turning with him. They walked away together. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, and she was aware of the eyes following them, dozens of them, and she kept her posture straight and her chin level, and she breathed through her nose and told herself to hold it together for exactly as long as it took to get out of Trevor's eye line. When they were far enough across the room that the crowd had absorbed the distance between them and the earlier scene, she turned to the man beside her and said, in a low, careful voice, I don't know who you are. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the first time his attention had been fully directed at her rather than at the situation. Up close, there was something in his eyes that was harder to categorize than the rest of his face. Not warmth, exactly. Something more complicated. My name is Kong Min Jae, he said. She waited for more. There wasn't more. He said his name like it was sufficient information, like anyone reasonable would be expected to fill in the rest. She didn't know the name. She filed that away as noteworthy and kept her voice even. Why did you do that? You were about to lose ground to someone who didn't deserve the satisfaction. It was such a specific assessment of the situation, accurate, stripped of pretense, that she almost didn't know what to do with it. That's not your problem to solve. No, he agreed easily. It's not. He glanced across the room once, briefly, with the particular quality of attention of someone who monitors spaces as a habitual practice. Then he looked back at her. There are things about tonight that will become clearer later. For now, I'd suggest you stay near me until the gala concludes. Why? Because the people in this room are already revising their understanding of who you are, he said, and some of those revisions will require follow-up. She studied him. He didn't look away from her study, didn't shift, didn't offer anything additional to make her more comfortable. He simply waited, and she understood somehow that this was just how he occupied space. Completely, without apology, without the performance most people felt compelled to put on when they were being evaluated. She said, I'm not going to pretend to be someone's wife in front of a room full of people without knowing what I'm getting into. You already have, he said, without cruelty. The question now is what comes next. She didn't have a response to that. She stood there with her water glass and her pinching heels and the heat still faintly in the back of her neck, and she thought about Trevor's face when Min Jae had said those 4 words. And she thought about the particular relief she'd felt when the crowd's attention had shifted, and she hated that it had been relief, hated that she'd needed it from anyone, least of all a stranger. One evening, she said finally. Min Jae inclined his head slightly. It was not agreement exactly. It was acknowledgement. There was a difference she sensed, and it was one he was aware of. The rest of the gala passed in a texture Nia had difficulty organizing into clean memory afterward. She moved through the room alongside Min Jae, and the experience of doing so was unlike anything she had a ready comparison for. It wasn't that people feared him, exactly. Or rather, it wasn't only that. It was something more precise. People calculated him. Each person who moved into their orbit performed a rapid, almost involuntary assessment and adjusted themselves accordingly, posture straightening, voices moderating, smiles appearing that had more diplomacy than warmth behind them. An older Japanese executive who'd been holding court near the center of the room actually stepped aside as Min Jae passed, a motion so small that most people wouldn't have registered it. Nia registered it. She was a translator. She read subtext for a living. She caught Ji-yeon's eyes across the room at one point, and Ji-yeon's expression, wide-eyed, slightly alarmed, emphatically communicative in the way of someone who has too much to say and no venue to say it, told Nia that whoever Kong Min Jae was Ji Yeon knew, and the knowledge was significant. Min-jae spoke to 3 people during the evening with the quality of conversations that appeared casual and weren't. The kind of exchanges Nia had sat in on enough times to recognize everything chosen, nothing wasted, the real content running underneath the surface of the words like a current. He didn't introduce her as his wife again. He didn't need to. The Gala had done the work. She watched the information move through the room in the particular way of all social information, person to person, a word here, a glance there, a tilted head communicating something across a crowded space. Trevor was still somewhere in the room. She didn't look for him. She made a specific, deliberate choice not to look for him and spent the rest of the evening honoring that choice. It was close to 11 when Min-jae's hand returned to the small of her back and he said quietly, near her ear, "We should go." Together? Yes. She thought about protesting. The protest didn't quite form into something usable. She nodded once, set down her empty water glass on a passing tray, and walked with him toward the exit. The October air outside hit them both immediately, sharp and edged with the city smell of Tokyo at night, exhaust and food stalls and something metallic underneath it all. 2 black vehicles were waiting at the base of the steps. Min-jae moved toward them without hesitation, and she followed, because at this point the shape of the evening had its own momentum, and arguing against it felt like shouting at weather. The driver of the first vehicle, a man built like architecture, face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality, opened the rear door without being asked. Min-jae waited for Nia to get in. She got in. He followed. The car pulled away from the Aoyama Grand Hall into the dark stream of Tokyo traffic, and Nia sat in the leather interior and watched the city lights begin to move past the window. And she told herself she would get her explanation now, in this car, before they arrived anywhere. She said, "Start talking." Min-jae looked at her. In the intermittent light of the passing street lamps, his face moved in and out of shadow in a way that made it harder to read than it had been in the Gala. "What specifically do you want to know? Why you said what you said, what you actually want, what tonight was really about?" Those are 3 separate questions. I know. I was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she thought, just ordering something. Then he said, "There is an agreement between our organizations that requires the appearance of a certain kind of stability. Your firm handles translation work for 3 companies in Tokyo that are connected to my interests. Your name appeared in documents I reviewed 8 months ago. When I saw you tonight, the situation presented a utility." She let that sit for a moment. "You recognized me from a document. I review everything connected to my interests carefully. And you decided in the middle of a charity gala to announce a marriage. The alternative was watching someone waste 15 minutes of your evening for no productive purpose. That is, not a reason to tell a room full of people we're married. It served multiple purposes," he said, with infuriating calm. "The statement silenced your ex-boyfriend. It also communicated something useful to a specific number of people in that room who have been monitoring my personal situation for business-adjacent reasons. And it established a connection between us that will make the next stage of our arrangement considerably more straightforward." Nia stared at him. "What arrangement?" He turned to look at her fully, and in the shifting light of the city moving past them, she could see that the expression in his eyes had changed. Not warmer, exactly, but more direct. Like he was offering her the unmediated version of something rather than the curated one. "I need a wife," he said. "Not in the way you're thinking. I need a specific kind of visible partnership, a person who is fluent across 3 languages, who is already embedded in legitimate professional networks in this city, who is composed under pressure, and who is not afraid of the shape of my world." He paused. "You handled yourself in there with more control than most professionals I work with. That was not accidental." She said carefully, "I don't know what shape your world is." "No," he said. "You don't. Not yet." She was about to respond, to push back on the "not yet," to establish something about the boundaries of this conversation and whatever it was leading toward, when the driver said something in Korean, sharp and short. Min-jae's entire body changed. It was subtle, just a shift in the quality of his stillness. The way the controlled composure she'd been reading all evening compressed itself into something denser. He looked forward and said something back to the driver, equally short. Then he reached across and pressed her back against the seat with one arm, not aggressive, but absolute, and said, "Stay down." She said, "What?" The back window of the car exploded inward. glass everywhere. She felt it hit her shoulder and her hair before she registered the sound, which was wrong, backward, the shattering coming before she understood its cause. The car accelerated. The driver was already talking into something, an earpiece, she realized, and from outside she could hear the sound of another engine, closing fast, and then another sound she had never heard in the context of her actual life before tonight. Gunfire. Not a single shot. Multiple. Rapid, controlled bursts that hit the body of the car in a pattern that meant whoever was firing knew what they were doing. The vehicle swerved, hard. She grabbed the seat in front of her and Min-jae was moving, already, doing something with a precision that told her this was not the first time he had been in a moving vehicle while someone was trying to kill him. He had a gun. She didn't know where it had come from. He had it now, and he was watching the mirrors and giving the driver instructions she couldn't follow because they were in Korean, rapid, and clipped. But the driver responded to each one immediately, and the car was doing things she hadn't known cars could do on a city street. Cut angles, speed changes, the specific controlled violence of high-speed tactical driving. Another shot hit the rear passenger panel. Nia pressed herself flat and breathed through her mouth and thought, very clearly, this is real. This is actually happening. She'd been in difficult situations in her professional life, negotiations that went sideways. A mugging in the Shimokitazawa neighborhood 18 months ago that had ended with her sprinting 4 blocks and losing a shoe. This was categorically different. This had the specific, irreversible texture of something that could end badly for her body, and her brain was processing it in a way that felt strangely calm, like the shock was so complete it had produced its own anesthetic. The car turned hard, left, and she slid against the door. The sound of the pursuing engine dropped briefly, then resumed. Min-jae said something to the driver. One word, urgent. And she felt the car accelerate again, past anything reasonable for a city street, the lights of Tokyo blurring in her peripheral vision into long horizontal streaks. And then they were off the main road, in something narrower, darker. An alley or a service road, the walls of buildings close on both sides. And the pursuing engine sound had changed, falling behind, losing ground. The driver kept going for another 2 minutes at speed before finally decelerating, pulling them into what appeared to be an underground parking structure. The gate sealed behind them. The car stopped. Silence. Nia's hands were shaking. She noticed it from a slight distance, the way you notice something about someone else. Clinical, removed. Her hands were shaking and there was glass in her hair and the window beside her was gone. Min-jae turned to look at her. His jacket was dark in one place, on the left side near the ribs. It took her a moment to understand what that darkness meant. You're hit, she said. It grazed, he said. Same tone as everything else, same complete economy of expression. That's... She stopped. Looked at the size of the darkened area. That is not a graze. We'll address it upstairs. Min-jae, Nia. He said her name. Her first name, without introduction or preamble, like he'd been using it for years. And the quality of the single word was enough to stop her. Not commanding, just certain. We'll address it upstairs. Right now I need you to be steady. She looked at him. At the blood on his jacket. At the gun he was now lowering, the way a person lowers something they've been holding for a while and can finally set down. She thought, I don't know you. I have been in your company for 3 hours. I do not know your world, or your rules, or why someone just tried to kill you on the streets of Tokyo with me in your car. And then, underneath that thought, another one, quieter and more honest. But you stepped in front of a situation tonight, and you didn't have to. And whatever your reasons were, the result was the same. She said, upstairs. Okay. But you're going to tell me everything. Min-jae looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he said, yes. It was the first thing he'd said all evening that sounded like an actual promise. The driver was already out of the car, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone running a post-incident protocol. 2 other men she hadn't seen before materialized from the structure, emerging from positions near the gate, near the elevator bank. And the way they moved confirmed everything she'd been processing about the shape of the world she'd just been pulled into. She got out of the car. Glass fell from her hair onto the concrete floor. Min-jae got out on his side and stood straight, which told her he was managing the injury through will alone. She could see it now in the careful way he moved. Not stiff, but controlled in a specific way, the way of someone keeping their breathing monitored. They walked to the elevator. The men fell in around them without being asked. She stood in the elevator beside him and watched the floors rise and didn't speak, and he stood beside her and breathed in a slow, measured rhythm, and she could feel the heat coming off him, the particular heat of a body dealing with damage it hadn't asked for. The elevator opened onto a corridor that was silent and expensive and softly lit, and at the end of it was a set of double doors that the driver opened without a key. Biometric panel, she registered, and then they were inside. The penthouse was immense and almost aggressively calm, all clean lines and dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the Tokyo skyline like a painting. City lights extended to every horizon. From up here, the streets where someone had just tried to kill them looked orderly and distant, like something arranged for aesthetic effect. Min-jae moved to a chair and lowered himself into it with the controlled precision of someone who knows that if they move wrong, they'll lose the careful management of something they are not ready to lose. He looked at her from the chair. "There's a medical kit," he said. "Third cabinet in the kitchen. Can you—" "I already know," she said. She found it where he said. She brought it to him, and she sat across from him on the low table, and she opened the kit with hands that were still very slightly shaking, and she looked at him and said, "Take the jacket off." He did. Underneath, the shirt was soaked through on the left side. He unbuttoned it with the same economy of movement he brought to everything, and she looked at what the bullet had done, and she took a breath through her nose and told herself she could do this. She was good at managing what was in front of her. She'd always been good at that. She worked in silence for a while, and he sat in silence while she worked, and outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Tokyo skyline glittered in complete indifference, and somewhere in the city, people who had just tried to kill them were still out there, already planning what came next. She pressed a gauze pad against the wound and held it firm, and Min-jae's jaw tightened. The first crack in the composure she'd seen all night. And she said, without looking up from her work, "Who sent them?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That is what I intend to find out." "Is this going to happen again?" Another pause. Longer. "Possibly." She pressed harder. He didn't make a sound. She looked up at him then. Really looked. The same way he'd looked at her in the car. At the angles of his face. At the thing in his eyes that was not warmth, but was something she was beginning to think might be its own kind of weight. A private one. The kind you carried without putting down. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. He held her gaze and said nothing. "Min-jae." She said his name back to him, the same way he'd said hers, flat, specific, a full stop. "I just got shot at in the back of your car. Whatever boundaries existed between my not knowing and needing to know, we passed them about 45 minutes ago." I was quiet for a long moment, and she could see something moving behind his expression. Not reluctance, exactly. More like the particular care of someone deciding how much to lift from something they'd been keeping sealed for a long time. Then he said, "There was a girl, my sister. She was 22. The was. Present tense converted to past. She heard the whole sentence in the weight of that single verb. She kept the pressure on the wound and said nothing, and waited. 5 years ago, he said. A rival organization. They targeted her not because of anything she had done, because of what her association with me meant." He stopped. Then, more quietly, "She was the only person I had any reason to be careful about losing." The room was completely still. "The people tonight," he said. "A different organization, but the same understanding of leverage. They have started watching who I'm near, which means, she said, finishing it, that what you announced in that ballroom tonight changed my situation." "Yes." She processed that. She kept her hand steady on his side and she processed it, and she felt the shape of it arrange itself in her chest into something clear and not entirely comfortable. "You knew," she said. "When you stepped in, you knew it would make me a target." He looked at her. He didn't look away. "I made a decision quickly, with incomplete information. The decision was not without risk to you. That is the truth." It was, she thought, probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. Not apologetic, not dressed in justification, just the unadorned fact, offered without exit. She pulled her hand back and checked the gauze and added another layer and taped it down with strips she cut from the roll in the medical kit. And she did it well. And when she was done, she sat back and looked at him and said, "So what happens now?" Min-jae looked at the Tokyo skyline, at the city lights, at the dark beyond the glass where the night was continuing its business completely, regardless of what had just happened to either of them. "Now," he said, "we figure out who knew enough to move against me tonight, and why they moved so quickly." He looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening, exactly, but admitting something. And we figure out what to do with you. I'm not a problem to be managed, she said. No, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was different from all the rest. Something that held a weight she couldn't categorize yet. You're not. Outside, Tokyo spread itself to every horizon, indifferent and glittering and utterly unaware that somewhere in its web of streets and alleys, among its 10 million people and their separate urgent lives, something had shifted tonight that could not be shifted back. Nia Hart sat in a penthouse she had not known existed 6 hours ago, her hands still faintly trembling, glass still somewhere in her hair. The man beside her bleeding slowly through a wound she had just dressed. A man whose name she had not known before tonight, whose world she did not understand, whose marriage declaration had turned her from a quiet life into something else entirely. She thought about Trevor's face at the gala, about the way the room had gone silent, about the cold certainty of Min Jae's voice when he said those 4 words that had changed everything. She thought about the sound of the back window shattering. She thought about the fact that she was still here, still breathing, still sitting upright, and that somehow, in the middle of all of it, her hands had been steady enough to dress a gunshot wound. She didn't know what that said about her. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. Min Jae's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something passed through his eyes. Not alarm. Something colder. More specific. He looked at her. I need to take this. She stood and moved away to give him space, walking toward the window, toward the glass and the city beyond it. She heard him answer in Korean, heard the cadence of the conversation shift almost immediately from his usual controlled pace to something sharper and shorter, and she didn't understand the words, but she understood the register. Something was wrong. Something more than what had already been wrong. She stood at the window and looked at Tokyo laid out below her. All those lights, all those lives, all that structured, beautiful, ordinary distance from everything that was happening in this room. Her own reflection looked back at her from the glass. Still in the black dress, hair slightly undone, expression that she couldn't entirely read even in her own reflection. Behind her, Min Jae's voice stopped. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the kind that preceded information that changed the shape of everything around it. She turned. He was looking at her from the chair with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite alarm, not quite anything she had a ready name for. The people tonight, he said slowly. They weren't sent by the organization, I thought. She held very still. Then who? She started. Someone inside, he said. Someone who knew where I would be tonight. Someone who knew I would be with you. The city lights continued their indifferent glitter behind her. Her heartbeat was slow and deliberate and very loud. Someone in your own organization, she said. Yes. She stood there in the penthouse with the city below her and the wound she'd just dressed a few feet away, and the full weight of what she'd just agreed to, what she'd been pulled into, what she'd been named as. And she thought, this is the moment, right now. This is the moment to decide whether to step back or step in. She already knew which way she was going to go. She didn't know yet what that was going to cost her. The phone call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Nia counted without meaning to. The way you count things when your body needs something to do and your mind is moving too fast for the rest of you to keep up. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with her arms crossed over her chest, and she watched the city below, and she counted the seconds of Min Jae's voice behind her, the clipped Korean syllables she couldn't decode, the one pause that lasted long enough to mean something significant had been said and needed to be absorbed. When he hung up, she turned around. I was still in the chair, but his posture had changed. The controlled composure was still there, but it had reorganized itself around something harder, something that had just arrived and needed to be accommodated. His phone was face down on his knee. The bandage she'd taped to his side was already showing a faint bloom of red at the center, small but present, and he was either ignoring it or genuinely not feeling it, and she wasn't sure which one was more concerning. Talk, she said. The vehicle that followed us tonight was registered to a logistics company. He looked at the phone. That company has done contracted work for my organization for the past 3 years. The man who manages their operations, his name is Park Sung-ho, has attended 2 of my quarterly briefings. He knows my schedule. He knows my usual routes. He stopped. He was in this building 4 days ago. Nia uncrossed her arms. You're saying this person, Park, arranged the attack? I'm saying Park had the access to arrange the attack. There is a difference. Is there? Right now? Min-jae looked at her then, and she could see the specific quality of what was moving behind his expression. Not anger exactly, but the cold, hard cousin of it, the kind that didn't burn but cut. In my world, the difference between suspicion and certainty is the difference between making a decision you can justify and making one that collapses everything else. Your world just put a bullet through your car window with me inside it. I know. That makes it my problem too. He was quiet for a moment, then, yes, it does. One of the men from the parking structure, she still didn't know any of their names, appeared in the doorway of the main room and said something in Korean. Short, informational. Min-jae responded without looking away from Nia, and the man withdrew. My second in command is on his way, Min-jae said. His name is Dai Jung. He's been with me for 9 years. Is he on the list of people who might have arranged tonight? Something flickered in his eyes. No. You're certain. There are very few things I am certain about. He held her gaze. Dai Jung is one of them. She noted the particular weight in that statement and filed it. She moved to the couch across from him, not close, not distant, functional, and sat down and looked at him with the same directness she used in difficult translation sessions when the person across the table was trying to give her less than she needed. Your sister, she said. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A subtle atmospheric shift, like a pressure change. You said 5 years ago, a rival organization. She kept her voice even, not gentle, not clinical, just honest. Is the organization that came tonight connected to what happened to her? A long pause. The city outside continued its irrelevant glitter. Different structure, he said. Same philosophy. In this city, in this industry, there are organizations that operate by establishing what you care about and then reaching for it. It is not personal. It is strategic. My sister was not killed because anyone hated her. He stopped, looked at his hands. Something moved across his face that was the most human thing she'd seen from him all night. She was 22. She was studying design at a university in Seoul. She wanted to open a studio someday. She had nothing to do with any of this. Nia said nothing. She let the silence hold what it needed to hold. After that, he said, I made a decision that I would give no one anything to reach for. No family, no visible attachments, no leverage. He looked up at her. Tonight complicated that considerably. You're saying what you did at the gala, announcing the marriage, gave them a target. I'm saying I made a decision quickly, with a reason that felt sufficient in the moment, and I may have underestimated how fast certain people would move on new information. She thought about that. Thought about the ballroom, the crowd, the way information had moved through it in waves. Someone at the gala tonight, someone who saw us, they made a call. Within the hour, yes, which means someone at a charity gala for an anti-trafficking foundation is feeding intelligence to people who run vehicles with guns through Tokyo streets. Several of the people at that event tonight move in multiple worlds, he said. This city has a way of blurring lines. Before she could respond, the elevator at the end of the corridor opened and 2 people came through. The driver from earlier. And behind him, a man in his late 30s who moved with the particular efficiency of someone who is always arriving from somewhere urgent and going somewhere equally urgent. He was broad-shouldered, not quite Min-jae's height, with a face that was less composed and more openly watchful. The face of someone who spent a lot of time reading rooms rather than controlling them. He came through the doorway, took in the scene with one comprehensive sweep. Min-jae in the chair, the bandaged side. Nia on the couch. The general atmosphere of a situation that had not resolved cleanly, and said something rapid in Korean that had the rhythm of a status report and a question combined. Min-jae answered, brief, directional. The man looked at Nia. His expression was not unfriendly, but it was not comfortable either. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. This is Dai Jung, Min-jae said. He speaks English. Dai Jung said, I know who she is. His English was good, American accented, with the slight flatness of someone who'd learned it from media and business contexts rather than lived experience. I've been aware of the translation firm connection for some time. Then you have context, Nia said. I have some context. Tonight added considerably more. He moved to stand near Min-jae's chair, and the configuration of the room shifted. The 2 of them on one side of it now, Nia on the other, which she noted without reacting to. Park Sung-ho's phone has been off since 9:47 this evening. That's 40 minutes before the attack, Nia said. Both men looked at her. Dai Jung with fresh assessment, Min-jae with something that might have been the beginning of something. Yes, Dai Jung said. So he knew when it would happen. He turned the phone off before it happened, so there's no location data placing him in contact with anyone during the window. She looked at Min-jae. Has he done anything unusual in the past week? Changed routine, canceled meetings, moved money? Dai Jung said, carefully. Those are the right questions. I'm a translator, she said. I've worked in rooms where people lie for a living. You learn to read the gaps. The two men exchanged a look, brief, containing a full conversation. And then Dai Jung turned back to her. He missed a Thursday briefing, said he was sick. We have him on camera at a restaurant in Roppongi that evening with two men we haven't identified yet. Then you have something to work with. We have the beginning of something to work with, Min-jae said. There is a difference. You said that before. The difference between suspicion and certainty. She looked at him steadily. I understand the principle, but you're also sitting in that chair with a wound that needs better medical attention than what I was able to give you. And someone out there is already planning the next move, so the window for careful, methodical certainty is probably shorter than you'd like. Min-jae held her gaze for a moment. Then he said to Dai Jung, something in Korean, short, decided. Dai Jung nodded and pulled out his own phone and began moving toward the far end of the room, already in a separate conversation. Min-jae looked back at Nia. There will be a doctor here within the hour. Good. In the meantime, I need you to understand something about your position. My position, she said. You mean the position you put me in tonight? Yes. He didn't qualify it. She was beginning to understand this about him. He didn't soften the edges of things that had sharp edges. It wasn't cruelty. It was a form of respect she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with yet. What happened in that ballroom is already in the pipeline of information that moves through this city. By tomorrow morning, there are people in at least 4 separate organizations who will know that Kang Min-jae appeared publicly with a woman and called her his wife. That is not information that gets walked back. It is information that changes the calculation of every one of those organizations. Changes it how? Some will see it as a softening, a vulnerability, something to exploit. And the others? The others will be curious, cautious, waiting to see what it means. What does it mean? He was quiet for long enough that she almost repeated the question. Then, that depends on what you decide. She looked at him. You're asking me something. I'm asking you, he said, whether you want to step back or forward. I can arrange for your safety for the next several weeks while this situation resolves. A secure location. Full removal from anything connected to my operations. You go back to your work, your life, your translation firm. You are protected but separate. And the other option. You stay in this. You maintain the arrangement that was declared tonight. You become, visibly, part of my world while we work through what happened. You're asking me to keep pretending to be your wife. I'm asking you, he said, whether pretending is still the right word for what you'd be doing. The room was very quiet. Dai Jung was still on his phone at the far end. The city outside was doing its eternal, indifferent thing. Nia looked at the man in front of her, at the bandage she'd taped to his side, at the blood that had dried dark on his shirt collar, at the expression he was carrying that was so completely sealed against the world that she understood for the first time that it had probably been sealed that way for 5 years. Since a 22-year-old who wanted to open a design studio had been taken from him to make a point. She said, I'm not good at hiding. I know, he said. I watched you for 3 hours in a room full of people who were all hiding something. You were the most honest person in it. That landed somewhere she didn't expect. Okay, she said. Okay, which option? Forward, she said. I stay. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The way he'd done in the car. The unmediated version. And then he nodded once. Just once. But the quality of it was different from all the prior acknowledgments. She thought, I have just agreed to something I do not fully understand. She thought, that is probably true of every significant decision anyone ever makes. She thought, my hands are still steady. The next 2 hours moved in layers. Dai Jung made calls, returned, reported, made more calls. Men moved in and out of the penthouse with the quiet operational efficiency of people who'd spent years making complicated things look orderly. Someone brought food, simple, practical, a tray of things that could be eaten without sitting down. And Nia ate because her body had been running on adrenaline since the first gunshot, and she knew from experience with difficult situations that you ate when food was available, regardless of whether you felt hungry. Min-jae didn't eat. She said something about it once, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost amused, almost, and said he would eat when there wasn't an active intelligence problem on the table. She decided not to push it. The doctor arrived at 12:43. He was Japanese, older, with the specific practiced calm of someone who'd been making late-night house calls to difficult addresses for a long time. He didn't ask questions about what had happened. He examined Min-jae with thorough professional efficiency, said something to Min-jae in Japanese about the wound depth, added proper stitches to replace Nia's emergency dressing, and departed within 30 minutes. On his way out, he paused briefly and looked at Nia's right arm. She hadn't noticed until that moment that there was a cut along her forearm from the shattered window glass, about 2 inches long, and he cleaned and dressed it with the same efficiency before leaving. She hadn't felt it. She registered that as informational. Around 1:30 in the morning, Dai Jung came to stand near Min-jae and spoke in a low voice in Korean for several minutes. Min-jae listened without interrupting, which was apparently unusual enough that she noticed it from across the room. When Dai Jung finished, Min-jae said 2 words. Dai Jung's expression confirmed they were the right 2 words and went back to work. Min-jae looked at Nia. Park met with a man named Ishida Ryota last Tuesday. Ishida runs financial operations for the Kuroda Syndicate. The Kuroda Syndicate, a Japanese organization, old structure. They've been looking for a foothold in the import routes my people control for about 18 months. They've been careful, patient. He paused. Too patient for me not to have suspected they were building to something. I should have moved faster. Is that guilt or analysis? He considered the question with more seriousness than she expected. Both. Can you get to Park before the Kuroda organization realizes you're on to him? That depends on how good their communication is. How good is it? Better than I'd like. Nia turned this over. She thought about the mechanics of it, the pressure points, the communication channels, the specific kind of leverage that moved things quickly in environments like this. She'd spent 2 years in Tokyo translating for organizations that operated in the gray spaces between legitimate and not, and she'd learned, by proximity if nothing else, how certain kinds of information moved and how it could be redirected. Park knows he's burned, she said. He turned his phone off before the attack, which means he planned to go dark. But if he went dark too early, the Kuroda people might not know the operation failed tonight. There could be a window. Both men were looking at her now. If you can get someone close to Park in the next few hours, before he surfaces and reports, there's a chance the Kuroda organization still thinks tonight succeeded, that you're dead or incapacitated. She looked at Min-jae. Does that change any of your options? A pause. Dai Jung said something in Korean that had the quality of agreement. Min-jae said, "You've been in this situation for approximately 4 hours. I've been in rooms where things are at stake for my entire career," she said. "The language is different, but the structure is the same." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something to Dai Jung, longer this time, with more direction in it, and Dai Jung left the room immediately. Min-jae looked at Nia. "You should sleep." "I'm not going to sleep. There's a room prepared." Min-jae. She said his name with the same flat, complete quality she'd used earlier, and he stopped. "I agreed to forward, not sideways. If you're making decisions about this situation tonight, I'm in the room for them." He held her gaze. The controlled composure was fully present and fully itself, and underneath it, she was beginning to be able to read underneath it, which was either a skill or a problem. There was something that was not agreement, but was the consideration of agreement. "Then stay awake," he said. "I intend to." The next hour was operational. She sat and listened and occasionally asked questions that were answered directly, which she took as its own kind of acceptance. And she built her understanding of the geography of Min-jae's world from the fragments that moved through the room. The names, the structures, the specific pressures that had been building for 18 months around import routes and territorial margins, and the particular kind of war that was fought with information and positioning before it was ever fought with anything else. It was close to 3 in the morning when Dai Jung came back into the main room with his phone held out and an expression that was different from everything he'd worn previously. He spoke in Korean. Min-jae stood from the chair, carefully, the stitched side managing itself, and took the phone and listened. His face went through a change she tracked with all the precision she had. The jaw, the eyes, the set of the shoulders, all of it tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. He lowered the phone, looked at Dai Jung, said something quiet, very quiet. The kind of quiet that occupies a room completely. Dai Jung's face confirmed it was as bad as it sounded. Min-jae turned to look at Nia. He stood there with the phone at his side and the city behind him, and the expression of a man who had just received information that had changed the specific arrangement of every threat he was managing. "Park is dead," he said. The room was very still. "Someone reached him before our people did. Within the past 2 hours." He paused. "Which means the Kuroda organization knew we were still active tonight. Which means there is someone in this building." He stopped, looked around the room with the particular attention of someone seeing it differently than they saw it 5 seconds ago. "Someone in this building communicated our status to the Kuroda organization after the attack failed." Nia stood up. She thought about the evening, the men moving in and out, the doctor, the calls, the operational efficiency of the people she'd watched work. And she thought about the particular problem of a traitor in a sealed environment, and she understood now what it meant that Park was dead. Not just that a lead was gone, that someone close enough to act had acted, within hours of the attack failing, to eliminate the one person who could directly connect the Kuroda organization to what had happened tonight. The traitor wasn't outside. The traitor was somewhere in the radius of this room. Dai Jung had gone very still, not with guilt, she thought, with the specific horrified stillness of someone who has just understood the geometry of their own exposure. "How many people knew we were operational tonight?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was mildly surprised by that. 12, Min-jae said, "including the men in this building, including the doctor." "The doctor left 30 minutes ago." "Yes." "Then the window for the communication was between 10:45 and now, which is 7 people." Min-jae looked at her with the full, unfiltered quality of his attention, and she understood that whatever she'd been to him at the beginning of this evening, a utility, a coincidence, a woman he'd intervened for in a ballroom with reasons she still hadn't fully unpacked, she was something different now. She could see the reclassification happening in real time. She held his gaze and didn't move. 7 people. 1 traitor. A dead man who'd been the only clean thread back to the source of the night's violence. And somewhere outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city turning quietly toward morning with no knowledge whatsoever of the war being waged in a penthouse above its skyline. Dai Jung said softly, with the particular weight of someone saying something they've been carrying for exactly as long as it took to be sure. "Min-jae, the doctor." Min-jae turned. The 2 men looked at each other, and the silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. And what moved through it in those 3 seconds was the complete and irreversible understanding that the night was far from over. The doctor's name was Mori Kenji, and he had been treating Min-jae's people for 6 years. That was the first thing Dai Jung said, after the silence broke. 6 years. He said it the way you say a number when the number has just become a wound. Not a fact anymore, something that costs something to hold. Min-jae didn't move for a long moment. He stood with the phone at his side and his eyes on the middle distance, and his jaw set in a way that Nia had already learned to read as the external surface of something that was working very hard underneath. Then he said, in English, which she understood was for her benefit, "Get me his file." Dai Jung was already on it. Nia sat back down. Not because she was comfortable. Her body had not been comfortable since the back window of the car had come in, but because standing felt like anticipation. And anticipation was a state she couldn't afford to maintain indefinitely. She watched Min-jae move to the window and stand there with his back to the room, looking at the city, and she thought about what it meant to have trusted someone for 6 years and then receive a phone call at 3 in the morning that made you recalculate every interaction you could remember. She knew something about that. Not in this register, not with these stakes, but the specific quality of that recalculation, she knew it. Dai Jung came back with a tablet. He set it on the low table and brought up a file that had the organized density of something that had been maintained carefully over time. Photographs, dates, transaction records, a network diagram with names connected by lines of varying thickness. Min-jae turned from the window and came to look at it, and Nia leaned forward without being invited to, and no one told her not to. The diagram showed Mori Kenji at the center of a small cluster of connections. Most of them were medical. A clinic in Minato, a pharmaceutical supplier, 2 names that Dai Jung identified in a low voice as other private practitioners who serviced similar clientele. But at the edge of the cluster, connected by a thin line that had been added in a different color than the rest, was a name. Ishida Ryota, the same man Park had met at the restaurant in Roppongi, the Kuroda Syndicate's financial officer. How long has that connection been in the file? Min-jae said. His voice was very flat. Dai Jung said, it was added to the background monitoring system 8 weeks ago. It was flagged as low priority. A single observed interaction. They were at the same event, a medical industry dinner. It appeared incidental. He stopped. I reviewed the flag and classified it as ambient. I did not escalate it. The room absorbed that. Min-jae looked at Dai Jung with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier, but something worse. The specific expressionlessness of a person recalibrating trust in someone they have not previously had cause to recalibrate. Dai Jung held the look. His jaw was tight. I made a judgment call. It was wrong. Yes, Min-jae said. One word, complete. Dai Jung didn't look away, didn't qualify, didn't reach for anything to soften it. Whatever was between them, 9 years of it, it apparently included the ability to take a hit like that straight on without collapsing. Nia said carefully, the question right now isn't who missed what. The question is what Mori took out of this building tonight and who he's already given it to. Both men looked at her. I was here for 30 minutes, she continued. He treated the wound. He saw the personnel in this building. He heard at minimum the volume and frequency of communication happening. He knows Min-jae is alive and operational. He knows there are at least 6 other people in this location. She looked at the diagram on the tablet. If Mori is the channel to Ishida, then Ishida knows all of that by now, which means the Kuroda organization's next move is already being planned with accurate information about your status. Min-jae said, they'll move fast. They have to. They've already spent one operation tonight. They can't let it sit unresolved. The longer it sits, the more time you have to find them and respond. They need to close this before dawn gives you working hours. Dai Jung said, that's 2 hours. Less, she said. Min-jae turned away from the table and made 3 phone calls in quick succession, all in Korean, all short. Between the second and third, he looked at Nia once, a look she couldn't fully interpret, but which had something evaluative in it that had nothing to do with doubt. More like someone measuring the distance between where they are and where they need to be. The third call ended and he said to Dai Jung, pull everyone back to this building. Nobody moves independently until I know how deep this goes. Dai Jung hesitated, just half a beat. If we consolidate here, we lose our coverage on the Shinjuku facility. I know. Min-jae, the shipment scheduled for Thursday. I know. His voice didn't rise. It compressed. Pull them back. Dai Jung made the call. Nia watched the window, the city outside beginning its imperceptible shift toward the pre-dawn gray that preceded actual morning, the lights still burning but the darkness around them thinning at the edges. She thought about what consolidation meant in practical terms. She thought about a 22-year-old who had wanted to open a design studio. She thought about the specific arithmetic of a man who had spent 5 years refusing to give anyone leverage, and had then, in a ballroom, made a decision in under 30 seconds that had introduced a new variable into every equation. That variable was her. She knew it. She'd known it when she'd said forward instead of back. She'd made the choice with open eyes, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise now that the shape of the consequences was becoming visible. What she hadn't known, what she was knowing now, in this room, with the specific physical reality of a bandaged cut on her forearm and glass residue still somewhere in her hair, was how completely the decision would reorganize her sense of what she was doing in this city, what she'd come here to build, what quiet and independent and mine had meant when she'd crossed the ocean 2 years ago, and what they meant now, at 3:20 in the morning, in a penthouse above Tokyo with a man whose world was trying to kill him. She was inside it, fully. There was no version of the next few hours that didn't require her to be. One of the men from the parking structure came in. She'd started to identify him by his build, the way he held his right shoulder slightly higher than his left, and spoke to Dai Jung rapidly. Dai Jung's expression shifted. What? Min-jae said. Trevor Lawson, Dai Jung said. The name landed in the room with the particular wrongness of something that belongs in a different context entirely. Nia stood up. He's been picked up, Dai Jung said. 40 minutes ago, near his hotel in Akasaka. 2 men, professional, no witnesses. His hotel room was searched. He looked at Nia, not with accusation, with the careful delivery of someone presenting information they know is going to hit. They took his phone and his laptop, and a photograph. She said, what photograph? You and him. It appears to be from several years ago, personal. The specific cold that moved through her then was different from all the prior cold of the evening. It was targeted. It was the cold of understanding that someone had done their research, had reached back through her history, had located the most direct line between her and something that could be used, and had moved on it with a speed that said they'd been preparing this contingency before tonight had even begun. She said, "They took him to use against me." "To use against him," Dai Jung said, nodding at Min-jae. "Through you." Min-jae was looking at him. The expression on his face was the most complex thing she'd seen from him. Not guilt, not calculation, but something that occupied the space between them and acknowledged, without words, the full weight of what his decision in the ballroom had set in motion. "Trevor has nothing to do with any of this," she said. Her voice came out controlled. She was proud of that, and also aware that the control was costing something. "He's connected to you," Min-jae said. "In their understanding, that's sufficient. He's an arrogant, self-involved man who said unkind things to me at a party. He is not part of your world. He does not deserve—" She stopped, took a breath through her nose, held it. "Where are they holding him?" "We don't know yet. How long do we have before—" "We don't know that either." She looked at Min-jae directly. He held the look without deflection. "This is because of what you said tonight." "Yes," he said. Straight line, no detour. "Trevor could be killed because you announced a marriage in a ballroom." "Yes." She absorbed that. She let the full weight of it sit in her chest without pushing it away. The anger, and underneath the anger, something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The specific feeling of watching the consequences of a single moment multiply outward faster than anyone could track. "Then we have to get him out," she said. Dai Jung said, "We don't have a location." "Then we find a location." She looked at the tablet still on the table, at the network diagram with its colored lines. Ishida Ryota runs financial operations. He's not a field person. He organizes structures, manages assets, moves money. He would not personally supervise a kidnapping. He would use someone else. She looked at Min-jae. "Who does the Kuroda Syndicate use for physical operations? Who would Ishida call?" A pause. Min-jae and Dai Jung exchanged a look. "A man named Tanaka Hiroshi," Dai Jung said. "No relation to the Foundation. He runs a crew out of a warehouse complex near the waterfront in Koto." "You know where the warehouse is?" "We know the area, not the specific building. But you have people who can narrow it down. In 2 hours, in the dark, without alerting, Dai Jung." She said his name the way she'd learned to say names in difficult rooms. Not aggressive, but precise, signaling that she understood the obstacle and was asking him to move past it. "In 2 hours or less, the Kuroda organization is going to make another move against this location or against Trevor or both. We are not sitting here waiting for it." Dai Jung looked at Min-jae. Min-jae said nothing. He was watching Nia with that unfiltered quality of attention again, and she didn't have bandwidth to decipher it right now. "I can get a location," she said, "if I can get Mori's number." Both men went very still. "He doesn't know that we know," she said. "He left here thinking the operation was intact, that he'd passed information to Ishida and there would be no consequence. His phone is on. He's expecting to hear that the second operation succeeded." She looked at Min-jae. "If someone calls him with a cover, a medical follow-up about your condition, something that requires him to respond in a way that puts him in contact with Ishida's people, we can trace the communication chain." "That requires someone he'd believe," Dai Jung said. "Someone he's already met tonight," she said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant everyone in the room had arrived at the same understanding simultaneously and was deciding whether to say it aloud. Min-jae said, "No. I'm the only one he hasn't identified as part of your organization. To him, I'm a woman who is present at the scene, possibly a liability, possibly a resource. If I call him, present myself as concerned about your condition and looking for guidance, he'll engage. He's a doctor. It's his reflex." "It's also a direct line to a man who just helped arrange an ambush on my vehicle," Min-jae said. His voice had changed. The compression she'd heard earlier was back, but with a different source this time. "You are not— You said I could be in the room for decisions. This is not a decision. This is you volunteering for direct exposure. Trevor Lawson is sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Koto because I was standing next to you in a ballroom. That is the math of this situation." She held his gaze and didn't move. "I don't get to not do something about that. Nia, don't." She said it once, flat and final. The way you say a word when the word means I have already made this decision and I am not going to make it again. Get me Mori's number. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment, the longest single look he'd given her since the car, since the moment she'd pressed gauze against his side, and he'd let his jaw tighten and said nothing. She could see the specific effort it took him. Not the effort of a man being overruled, the effort of a man choosing to trust someone with something he wasn't accustomed to trusting anyone with. He looked at Dai Jung. A short exchange in Korean. Dai Jung's expression communicated something nuanced and resigned and ultimately compliant. He wrote a number on a slip of paper and handed it to Nia. She looked at it, memorized it, set it down. I need 5 minutes, she said, to think through the call, what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it. Take them, Min-jae said. She moved away from both of them, toward the far end of the room near the window, and she stood with her back to the city and thought about the specific architecture of a deception. She'd spent her career finding the gaps in language, the places where what was said and what was meant diverged, the moments when a person's trained surface cracked just enough to show the real structure underneath. She'd used that skill in conference rooms and diplomatic contexts and quiet offices where money and power moved through conversations like water through hidden channels. She'd never used it like this. She thought about tone, register, the specific quality of a worried voice that was not quite panicked, the voice of someone with a reason to call, but not enough information to be alarming. She thought about what Mori knew and didn't know, what his expectation was for the next few hours, what question would open him without warning him. She thought about Trevor, his face at the gala, the smirk she'd spent 3 years forgetting, the specific way he'd looked at her bare ring finger as though it confirmed something he'd always suspected about her. She thought about how completely she did not want him to die in a warehouse in Koto because of a night that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the strange gravity that had pulled her into orbit around a man she hadn't known 24 hours ago. She picked up her own phone, looked at it, put it down, looked at the number on the slip of paper. She picked up the phone again and dialed. It rang 3 times. Then, "Hi." Mori's voice, careful, slightly alert in the way of someone who'd been expecting communication, but not necessarily this communication. She said, in Japanese, "Dr. Mori, this is Nia, the woman who was with Kong-san this evening. I'm so sorry to call at this hour." She kept her voice at the precise register of controlled distress. Not panic, worry. The contained kind that asked permission before it breathed. "I didn't know who else to call. His condition has changed." A pause on the line. Then, carefully, "Changed how? He's running a fever. He won't let me call anyone else, and I don't know enough to judge whether this is serious." She let a breath in through her nose that was audible but not dramatic. "I know it's very late. I just didn't. How high is the fever?" She gave him a number. High enough to concern, not high enough to be obviously fabricated. "And the wound site? It looks the same to me, but I'm not a medical professional." She let a small silence in. Just an, "Is there someone I should contact? He has people, but I'm not sure who I'm supposed to reach in a situation like this." Another pause. Longer. She tracked it, counted the beats the way she'd counted Min-jae's phone call earlier. 3 beats was calculation. 5 beats was something else. It was 5 beats. "I can come back," Mori said. "No," she said quickly. Quick enough to be instinctive, slow enough not to be rehearsed. "No, I don't want to pull you out again at this hour. Is there a number? Someone on his medical staff I can reach?" "There's a clinic he uses in Minato. I can give you the number." "Thank you." She waited. He gave her a number. She wrote it down, said thank you again in the specific warm distress of someone genuinely relieved, and ended the call. She turned around. Min-jae and Dai Jung were both watching her from across the room. She held up the paper with the clinic number. "He gave me a number that I guarantee routes to somewhere inside the Kuroda communication structure. Trace it." Dai Jung took the paper and moved immediately. Min-jae crossed the room toward her. He stopped when he was close enough that she could see the specific quality of what was in his expression. Not the controlled surface, not the strategic composure, something underneath all of it, something that had been sitting underneath it for a long time and had just been brought closer to the surface by watching her do what she'd just done. He said, "You're very good at that." "At lying? At finding the gap between what someone expects and what's actually there." She looked at him. "It's what I do. I live in gaps. That's what translation is. You stand in the space between two languages, two realities, and you figure out how to carry meaning across without losing it. She paused. Tonight I'm just carrying something different. He held her gaze and said nothing, and in the silence she understood that something had shifted between them again. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the specific quiet permanence of tectonic things. Then Dai Jung's voice came from across the room, sharp and immediate. I have a location. Both of them turned. Dai Jung was looking at his screen with an expression that was not relief. It was the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for and is simultaneously processing what finding it costs. Warehouse complex, East Waterfront, Koto Ward, he said. 3 buildings. The number Mori gave routes to a burner that pinged a cell tower 200 meters from the central building 45 minutes ago. He looked up. Trevor Lawson is almost certainly in that building right now. Min-jae said, how many people does Tanaka run? In a field operation like this, 10 to 15. And hours? 8 available, fully operational, plus you. Dai Jung paused. And the complication. The word complication arrived in the room with a specific gravity that made Nia look from Dai Jung to Min-jae. Min-jae had gone very still. What complication? She said. Dai Jung looked at Min-jae, and the look that passed between them was the kind that had a full conversation inside it, and none of the conversation was good. The warehouse, Dai Jung said. We know it. We've known it for 6 months. We've had a surveillance asset inside Tanaka's operation since March. He stopped. That asset reported to us through Park Sung-ho. The room went completely quiet. Park Sung-ho, who was dead, who had been the only communication channel to an asset inside the Kuroda Syndicate's field operation, who had been silenced before he could be reached, which meant the asset was dark, unreachable, cut off from the chain of communication that kept them safe, which meant there were now 10 to 15 armed men in a warehouse in Koto, and a kidnapped civilian somewhere inside it, and an unknown number of Kuroda Syndicate operatives who had been expecting a second operation to succeed tonight, an operation that hadn't, which meant they were frightened and reactive, which was the most dangerous state for armed men to be in. And the one person who could have told them the internal layout, the guard positions, the contingency plans, was the asset's name was Renji. That was all Dai Jung had, a name, a face from a photograph taken 8 months ago, and the last known position inside Tanaka Hiroshi's operation, a logistics coordinator, embedded, responsible for scheduling warehouse intake and outbound freight, middle management, invisible enough to last, connected enough to matter, and now completely unreachable because the one thread back to him had been severed with a bullet somewhere in Tokyo's back streets 2 hours ago. Min-jae stood in the center of the room and looked at the floor for approximately 4 seconds. Nia had already learned that 4 seconds of that particular stillness meant he was not stuck. He was compressing, taking everything available and running it through whatever internal architecture he used to make decisions that other people would need a week and a committee to arrive at. He looked up. We go anyway, Dai Jung said. Without internal intelligence, we go anyway. Min-jae, 8 men against 15 in a blind entry. The longer Trevor Lawson sits in that building, the more they understand he's not producing the result they expected. When they figure out he has no actual leverage over me, he stopped, looked at Nia once, briefly. They'll stop keeping him alive. Nobody argued with that. Nia said, I'm going. Min-jae turned to look at her with the specific quality of someone who had been expecting this and had not yet decided how to handle it. Trevor doesn't know any of your people, she said. If your team goes in and finds him in the dark, in a warehouse, after being held by armed men, he panics. He runs. He gets shot by accident or on purpose. She held the look steadily. I'm the only person in this room he'll recognize, the only voice that will make him stop moving and listen. You're also the only person in this room the Kuroda organization specifically targeted tonight, Min-jae said. Walking you into that building is the last thing they'll expect, she said. They took him to use against me. They're expecting me to be hidden somewhere, protected, unreachable. They are not expecting me to walk in. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet she'd learned to read as the final stage before a decision that couldn't be walked back. You stay behind the team, he said. You don't move without instruction. When we locate Lawson, you go to him and you keep him quiet and you do not leave his side until we are out of that building. Are those terms clear? Yes. Say them back to me. She did. He listened to every word. Good, he said. Then to Dai Jung, 20 minutes. The preparation happened fast and without ceremony. Dai Jung moved through the penthouse with the operational efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the doing of it didn't require thought, only execution. Nia changed out of the black dress in the room that had been prepared for her, found dark clothing laid out, practical, the right size, which told her someone in this organization thought about details at a level that was either impressive or unsettling, probably both. She tied her hair back, looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 3 seconds, thought, this is what forward looks like, went back out. The vehicles left the building at 4:17 in the morning. 3 of them this time, staggered, different routes. Nia was in the second vehicle with Min-jae and Dai Jung, and the drive through the pre-dawn streets of Tokyo had a quality entirely unlike the drive from the Gala. The city was quieter now, the lights fewer, the streets stripped down to their functional bones. Delivery trucks, a street sweeper moving along an otherwise empty boulevard. The specific gray dark of a city not yet awake, holding its breath between what the night had been and what the morning would be. Min-jae sat beside her and said nothing. His breathing was controlled and deliberate. She could hear it in the silence of the car, slow and measured, the way of someone managing a body that was carrying more than it wanted to admit. The stitched wound, the hours of sustained operational pressure, the specific weight of a man who had just decided to walk 8 people and 1 civilian translator into a blind entry against 15 armed men because the alternative was watching someone die for a mistake he'd made in a ballroom. She almost said something. She didn't. The warehouse complex was exactly what Dai Jung had described. 3 buildings arranged in an L shape along the eastern waterfront, the kind of industrial architecture that existed in every port city in the world, functional and anonymous, and designed to hold things that didn't need to be seen. The water was visible between the buildings, dark and flat, catching the ambient light of the city in long, broken reflections. They parked 4 blocks away, walked the rest in silence, spread across the width of the street in the loose formation of people who knew how to be in spaces without announcing themselves. The air smelled of salt water and cold concrete and something industrial underneath, oil or metal or both. Min-jae's hand found the small of her back once, briefly, as they turned into the approach corridor between 2 buildings. Not a claim this time. Something else. She registered it and kept moving. The central building had 2 visible entry points. The main freight door on the south face, which had light around its edges indicating interior illumination, and a personnel door on the east side that was dark but had a fresh scratch pattern on the lock casing that said it had been used recently. Dai Jung pointed at it without speaking. Min-jae nodded. The team reorganized in the dark, fluid and soundless, positions established by a series of hand signals that Nia watched and filed. They were good. She'd understood that abstractly in the penthouse. Watching it operate in real time was something else. There was no hesitation, no checking, no visible communication beyond the signals. Just 8 people moving into a configuration that had clearly been practiced until it lived in the muscle rather than the mind. Min-jae looked at her, held up one finger. Wait, she nodded. The first 4 men went through the personnel door in a sequence that lasted less than 12 seconds, and the silence that followed was so complete it had its own pressure, and she stood in the corridor with Dai Jung and 2 others and counted her own heartbeat because it was the only thing she could do that didn't require movement. 40 seconds. 50. A minute. Then Min-jae's voice, low, through Dai Jung's earpiece. She could hear it from 2 feet away in the silence. One word in Korean. Dai Jung said to her, "Move." She moved. The interior of the building was large and sectioned. Freight containers along the north wall, a raised office structure along the south, open floor space in between that smelled of diesel and stale water. The lighting was incomplete. Work lights strung at intervals that created patches of yellow illumination separated by deep shadow. She could see 2 of Min-jae's men at the far end, positioned near the container row. She could see the freight door and the chain that secured it. She could see, near the base of the office stairs, 2 men on the floor in positions that said they were not going to be getting up again. Tanaka's people. She looked at them once and looked away. Min-jae materialized from the shadow beside the container row. He moved toward her and she could see now, in the work light, that the controlled quality of his movement had acquired an edge, sharper, more compressed, The kind of physical intensity that didn't announce itself but was present in every step. He'd taken a hit somewhere. There was a fresh cut along his left jaw and his right hand was holding itself slightly differently than normal, the fingers not quite at full extension. She looked at the hand, looked at his face. He said quietly, "Don't." "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something." "Later," she said. He almost had an expression for that, something that existed for less than a second before the composure reasserted itself. He nodded toward the office structure. "Third room. 2 guards on the stairs, already handled. Tanaka himself is in the upper office. He has 3 men with him. Lawson is being held in the lower room." "Is he alive, conscious?" A pause. "Frightened." "Okay. My team will take the upper office. You go directly to Lawson. Dai Jung goes with you." He looked at her with the full, unfiltered version of his attention. "You have the time it takes us to reach Tanaka. After that, whatever happens in that upper room is going to be loud. You need Lawson moving before the noise starts." She said, "How much time?" 4 minutes? Maybe 3. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. "Okay." She moved toward the stairs. The lower room was behind a metal door that was locked from the outside, which told her everything she needed to know about the condition of the person inside. Dai Jung cut the lock with a tool she didn't look at and pulled the door open, and she went in first. Trevor Lawson was sitting against the far wall with his hands zip-tied in front of him and a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried. He was in the same suit he'd worn to the gala, jacket missing, shirt torn at the collar. When the door opened, he flinched back against the wall, the specific animal flinch of someone whose body had been receiving bad information for the past several hours and had decided that any new stimulus was a threat. Then he saw her. His face went through a sequence of expressions: disbelief, relief, an almost immediate secondary disbelief at the relief. And he said, in a voice that was rougher than she'd ever heard from him, "Nia, what the—" "Don't talk," she said. She was already moving toward him, crouching, looking at his hands. "Don't ask me questions. We have very little time." "What is happening? Who are these people? They took me from the hotel." "Trevor." She said his name the same way she said every difficult name in difficult rooms, flat and precise, and carrying the full weight of the instruction inside it. He stopped. She looked at his hands, assessed the zip ties, looked at Dai Jung over her shoulder. Dai Jung produced a blade, handled the zip ties in 4 seconds. Trevor stared at him, stared at Nia. "You're married," he said, like this had been sitting in him since the ballroom and was coming out now despite everything. "You're actually—" "Not the moment," she said. "How are you?" He looked at her clothing, at the cut on her arm, at the general texture of a person who had been in a difficult situation for several hours. "Nia, you're—" "I said not the moment." She got him to his feet, which required more work than she expected. His legs had been in one position for too long, and he came up unsteady, grabbing her arm for balance. He was heavier than she remembered. She held him up and said, "Can you walk?" "Yes, I think. Yes." "Then we're walking. Right now. You follow Dai Jung, and you don't stop and you don't ask questions until we are outside this building." "Who is Dai—" "Him." She pointed. "Go." From the upper office, directly above them, came the sound of a door being breached. Then voices. Korean, sharp. And then the specific compressed sound of a confrontation that was not going to resolve with conversation. Trevor said, "What is that?" "Walk," she said. He walked. Dai Jung was already moving back toward the main floor, and Nia kept Trevor's arm and moved behind him, and she could hear the sounds from above escalating. Not gunfire yet, something more physical, the sounds of a confined space with multiple bodies doing damage to each other. And she focused entirely on the floor ahead of her, and the door at the end of it, and the open corridor outside. They were halfway across the main floor when the upper office window broke. The sound was enormous in the warehouse's hollow acoustics, glass and wood, and then a human body hitting the freight container below the office window with a heavy, graceless impact that made Trevor make a sound she'd never heard from him before. She didn't look. She kept moving. The personnel door was ahead. 20 feet. 15. Then a figure came around the end of the container row. Not one of Min Jae's men. The posture was wrong. The position was wrong. And Dai Jung was already moving, but the angle was bad, and Nia had approximately 1 second to process what was happening before the man raised the weapon in his hand and pointed it at Trevor. She didn't think. That was the part she would process later, in the specific way you process things that happen too fast for thought. She just moved, left, pulling Trevor's arm, putting herself between the line of the weapon and him, through nothing but the raw physics of the moment and the specific reflex of a body that had decided somewhere in the past 4 hours what it was and wasn't willing to accept. The shot went wide. She felt the air move. She felt Trevor stumble. Dai Jung closed the distance in 2 seconds, and the man went down, and the weapon skidded across the concrete floor, and then there was silence. Sudden, complete, the specific silence of a thing that has just resolved itself. Trevor was against the container wall, breathing in the shallow, rapid way of someone whose body has just understood what almost happened. His eyes were on Nia. His face had lost whatever was left of the Gala version of himself. The immaculate suit, the practiced ease, the particular architecture of a man who had always been the most powerful person in any room he entered. He was just a person now, frightened and bewildered and looking at her like she was someone he'd never seen before. She supposed she was. "Nia," he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. "You—" "Exterior door," Dai Jung said. "Now." They went. Outside, the cold hit immediately, the waterfront air cutting through everything, sharp with salt and the metallic edge of the city before dawn. The vehicles were coming. She could hear them before she saw them, the low sound of engines navigating the approach corridor, and she stood in the open space between the building and the water's edge with Trevor beside her and Dai Jung scanning the perimeter, and she breathed, just breathed. Her hands were steady. She registered that again, the same way she'd registered it in the penthouse over the medical kit. Steady. Not because nothing had happened, but because she was, apparently, the kind of person whose hands stayed steady while things happened. She didn't know yet what to do with that information about herself. The first vehicle pulled up. The driver, the same broad-shouldered man from the parking structure, was already out, moving around to the rear door. Trevor said, "Who are these people?" "Mine," Min-jae said. He came through the personnel door behind them, and the look of him stopped something in Nia's chest. The stitched side, the jaw cut, the right hand that was now clearly damaged in a way that required attention, and underneath all of it the same composed, self-contained quality that she was beginning to understand was not a performance. It was genuinely the way he was organized. The interior structure of a man who had spent years ensuring that nothing could reach him by ensuring there was nothing reachable, and who had, in the course of a single evening, let something reachable exist again. He looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at him with the expression of a man reassembling his understanding of multiple things simultaneously. Then Min-jae looked at Nia. Just looked. The full unmediated version, without the composure in the way of it, without the strategic distance. She could see everything in it, the acknowledgement of what she'd done on the warehouse floor, the specific quality of what it had cost him to watch it happen and not be able to stop it, the thing underneath his entire way of being that he'd been keeping sealed for 5 years, and that the shape of this night had cracked, not dramatically, not with announcement, but the way real things crack, quietly, and then completely. He said, "You moved in front of him." "I know." "You weren't supposed to." "I know." He held her gaze for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds the city around them was completely irrelevant, and she understood that she had just done something that had changed the arrangement between them as permanently as the thing he'd said in the ballroom, but in the opposite direction, and in a register that had nothing to do with strategy or utility or the convenient arithmetic of an announced marriage. Then Dai Jung said, "We need to move." Min-jae looked away from her. The composure came back. Not all the way, but enough. He looked at the vehicle, looked at the waterfront, looked at the industrial dark of the building behind them, where his team was still working through the aftermath of what had just happened. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. He said to Dai Jung, in English, still for her, always for her when it mattered, "Tanaka is alive." Dai Jung said, "You want him?" "Alive," Min-jae said. "He talks first, everything else after." He looked at the building. "He's going to tell me exactly how deep the Kuroda organization goes inside my structure. Every name, every date, every decision that was made in the past 18 months that should have been mine to make." His voice was very quiet and very even. "And then we're going to end this," Trevor said, from somewhere to Nia's left, in a voice that was still shaky but had something of the old Trevor in it. The part that had always needed to understand what room he was in, who held the power, what the rules were. Is someone going to explain to me what is actually happening here? Nobody answered him immediately. Nia looked at Minjae. Minjae looked at Nia. And in the look between them was the full weight of the night. The ballroom and the shattered window and the blood and the warehouse floor and the 4 minutes in a lower room and the shot that had gone wide and everything that had shifted in the wake of everything else. And underneath all of it, specific and quiet and too honest to be comfortable, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for and neither of them was going to name yet. From inside the building, one of Minjae's men appeared in the doorway and spoke in Korean, short, urgent. Dai Jung translated without being asked. Tanaka's talking. Minjae turned toward the building, then stopped, looked back at Nia once more, and this time the look had something in it she recognized from the gala, the same quality as when he'd stepped into a situation he hadn't been required to step into, for reasons she still hadn't fully decoded, with a certainty that had required no performance. He said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "When this is over, I'm going to ask you something." She said, "Ask me now." Looked at her for a moment that stretched past its edges. "Not yet," he said. "There's one thing left to finish first." He walked back into the building. The waterfront held its cold silence around her. The dark water, the pre-dawn gray, the city beginning its slow, irreversible turn toward morning. And Nia stood at the edge of it and felt the full shape of the night settle into her body, like something that had found the place it was always going to end up. Trevor was saying something beside her. She wasn't listening yet. She was watching the door Minjae had walked back through, and she was thinking about one thing left to finish. And she was thinking about what came after finishing it. And she was thinking about the specific feeling of a decision that had been made not in a moment of calculation, but in the raw, unmanaged instant when a body moves before a mind can stop it. And what that said about where she already was. Tanaka Hiroshi was not a man who broke easily. That was the first thing Minjae said when he came back out of the building 40 minutes later, and the way he said it communicated everything about the 40 minutes that Nia was not going to ask about directly. His right hand had been wrapped in something, cloth, improvised, the kind of field dressing that addressed function before appearance. The jaw cut had stopped bleeding. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who was running on the last reserves of something he'd been spending all night, and he came to where she was standing near the second vehicle, and he stood beside her and looked at the water for a moment before he spoke. "He gave us 4 names, he said. "Inside my organization, 3 operational, 1 financial." He paused. "The financial one has been in place for 2 years. She said, 2 years. I was present at the quarterly briefings. He had access to route schedules, personnel assignments, the communication protocols." Minjae looked at the water. "Everything the Kuroda organization needed to build a case for moving against me. They've been patient, building the architecture of it from the inside for 2 years and waiting for the right moment. The gala was the moment. The gala was the trigger. The marriage announcement gave them urgency. They couldn't wait for a better window once they understood there was a visible connection. They had to move before I could consolidate." He turned to look at her then, and in the pre-dawn gray she could see the full cost of the night on his face. Not weakness, not defeat, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has spent one night watching the full weight of it become visible. They were right that it was a vulnerability. They were wrong about what kind. She held his gaze. "What's happening with Tanaka?" "He's being held until the 4 names are confirmed and secured. When that's done, I'll decide what comes next." He said it without elaboration, and she understood there were parts of his world she was inside of now and parts she was still outside of, and that was probably the correct arrangement. "And Ishida Ryota?" "Dai Jung is handling that communication." He looked at his wrapped hand for a moment, then back at the water. Ishida made a strategic error. He moved too fast, too visibly, and left too many threads. By morning, there will be enough documentation of the Kuroda organization's involvement in tonight's attack to make any further aggression against my operations an extremely costly decision for them. He paused. They understand cost. They'll recalculate. You're not going to war with them. A war with the Kuroda organization would last years and damage everyone adjacent to it. That is not an outcome that serves anyone's interests. He looked at her. What I'm going to do is make the cost of continued aggression so precisely clear that the option becomes unattractive. That is how these things end in this city. Not with fire, with arithmetic. She nodded slowly. She thought about the specific difference between the world she'd understood before tonight and the world she understood now. Not a dramatic difference, not the kind that movies made of, but a lateral shift. The same city, the same streets, the same Tokyo she'd been building her quiet life inside for 2 years, just with a different awareness of the structures underneath it, the weight-bearing elements that the surface was built on. She'd been translating for organizations that moved in the gray spaces between legitimate and not for 2 years, and she'd understood that abstractly. Tonight had made it specific. Tonight had given it a body. She found she was not frightened by the specificity. That was informational. Trevor appeared from around the front of the first vehicle, moving with the particular careful gait of a man whose body had been through something and was reminding him of it with each step. He'd found his jacket somewhere. One of Min-jae's men must have retrieved it from inside, and he was wearing it over the torn shirt, which somehow made the whole picture more incongruous. A man in an expensive suit jacket at a waterfront at 4 a.m. with dried blood on his temple, looking like a version of himself that had been taken apart and put back together without the instruction manual. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Min-jae, then at Nia, then back at Min-jae with the expression of a man who is doing significant internal revision in real time. He said, "She moved in front of a gun for me." Min-jae said, "I know. I don't—" Trevor stopped, started again. The practiced fluency was gone, the conference room version of Trevor Lawson. The one who always knew exactly how to enter a sentence and where to land it had been replaced by something rawer. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to say to that." Nia said, "You don't have to say anything. Nia, Trevor." She looked at him directly, and it was a different kind of looking than she'd done in the ballroom. Not the controlled management of a social situation, not the defensive positioning of a woman protecting her ground. Just her eyes on a person she'd known, and all the history that entailed, and the specific clarity that a night like this produced. "We had a relationship that ended badly. I've spent a reasonable amount of energy being angry about how it ended. Tonight I spent some of that energy on your behalf, and that's what it is. It doesn't rewrite anything. It doesn't create a debt." She paused. "But I want you to understand something." He waited. "The way you spoke to me in that ballroom tonight, the ring finger, the alone comments, all of it, that is the version of you that I stopped being able to love. Not because I'm broken or incomplete or whatever story you told yourself about why we didn't work. Because that particular habit of making yourself feel larger by making the people around you feel smaller is something I'm not willing to be near." She held the look steadily. "I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad we got you out. And I genuinely hope you go home and think about tonight and let it change something in you. But that's the last thing I'm going to say about us, and I mean it as the last thing." Trevor stood there, the armor he'd walked into the Aoyama Grand Hall wearing, the ease, the confidence, the practiced social dominance that she'd once found magnetic and then found corrosive and had finally found just sad, was completely gone. What was left was a person, uncertain and shaken, and she thought, possibly more honest in this moment than he'd been in years. He said quietly, "Okay." She nodded. He looked at Min-jae one more time, the particular look of a man registering the full dimension of someone he'd initially misread, and then he moved toward the first vehicle, where one of Min-jae's men was already waiting to take him back to his hotel. Min-jae watched him go without expression. Then he said, "That was a difficult thing to say." "No," she said. "It was an easy thing to say. It was just a long time coming." He looked at her. Something in the set of his face shifted, just slightly, just enough, and she thought again of that almost expression in the warehouse, the one that had existed for less than a second before the composure came back. Only now the composure was slower to reassert itself, like it was tired, like the night had worn down the mechanism that kept it automatic. She said, "You told me you were going to ask me something." I was quiet for a moment. The water moved against the pilings. Somewhere across the harbor, a light was moving, a boat, making its early morning run, indifferent to everything on this particular piece of shore. "When I saw you in that ballroom," he said, "I made a decision in approximately 8 seconds. I told myself it was strategic, that I had assessed the situation and identified a utility and acted on it." He paused. "That was not entirely the truth." She waited. "The truth was that I watched someone being taken apart in public by a person who didn't deserve the ground he was standing on, and I acted before I'd finished thinking about it." He looked at the water. "I have not done that in 5 years. I had very specific reasons for not doing that." "Your sister," she said. My sister. He said it quietly, with the particular quietness of a name that has been carried internally for a very long time and is rarely said aloud. After Suyon died, I made myself into something that couldn't be reached that way again. I removed everything reachable. I built everything around the principle that nothing outside the operational could matter, because anything that mattered was something they could use. He turned to look at Nia fully. I believe that completely. For 5 years I believed it without question. And then you said 4 words in a ballroom. And then I said 4 words in a ballroom. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of the architecture of one. And inside 6 hours, every principle I'd built the past 5 years on had been tested in ways I did not plan for. She looked at him, at the cut on his jaw and the wrapped hand and the exhaustion that was finally, after the night's worth of relentless compression, becoming visible in the set of his shoulders and the slight heaviness around his eyes. At the man underneath the legend of it, the actual person, the one who had a dead sister. He still said the name of quietly, who had looked at her across a warehouse floor with something he couldn't compress away, who had come back out of a building 40 minutes after walking into it and stood beside her at a waterfront and told her the truth instead of the version that served him. She said, "What were you going to ask me?" I was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I want to ask you whether you're going to stay. Not in the arrangement, not in the contract. In this." He held her gaze. In proximity to a world that puts you in a car chase and a warehouse in the same night. To a man who makes decisions that have consequences for people around him, and who has not always gotten those decisions right, and who spent 5 years convincing himself that the right answer to that was to make sure there was no one around him who could be affected by the getting it wrong. He stopped. "I'm not asking you to make a permanent decision at 4 in the morning on a waterfront after a night like this. I'm asking you whether the answer is not obviously no." She held the look for a long moment. She thought about what she'd come to Tokyo to build. The quiet life, the independent life, the life that was finally, carefully, hers. She thought about 2 years of Shimokitazawa walks and late-night grammar drills, and the specific pride of a person who had crossed an ocean and made something from the crossing. She thought about what forward meant. "It's not obviously no," she said. He nodded once. The quality of it was different from every prior nod of the evening. Less acknowledgement, more receipt. Like something had been handed to him that he was going to be careful with. Dai Jung appeared from the building and came toward them with the steady, purposeful walk of a man who had been running on pure operational necessity for 6 hours and was finally approaching the end of the list. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Minji and said, in English, which Nia understood was also for her, "The 4 names are confirmed. We have them all. The financial officer is in custody. The other 3 are being handled." He paused. Mori Kenji turned himself in to a contact in Minato 2 hours ago. He left a statement. "Coercion," Minji said. "His daughter." Kuroda had his daughter enrolled in a school in Osaka, had been making payments on her tuition for 3 years. When they needed him, they called in the debt. Dai Jung's voice was flat, but she could hear something in the flatness. Not sympathy, exactly, but the specific weight of a person who understands how a man can be turned by the right pressure on the right thing. He's asking for the chance to make it right. Minji looked at the water. "His daughter is safe?" She was never in direct danger. The threat was financial, not physical, but to him it was everything. Minji said it without judgment, just the fact of it, acknowledged and set down. "Put him somewhere secure for now. I'll deal with it when the rest is resolved." Dai Jung nodded. Then he looked at Nia, and the look was different from every look he'd given her through the night. Not the careful wariness of early hours, not the operational respect of the warehouse. Something more direct, more human. "You made the call to Mori," he said. "That's what got us the location. Without that, we go in blind, or we don't go in at all." He paused. "I wanted to say that clearly." She said, "You would have found another way." "Maybe," he said, "but not in 2 hours." He held the look for another moment, then turned back to Minji with the quiet efficiency of a man returning to work. "The vehicles are ready. We should get out of the waterfront before the morning crews start." They left the way they'd come. Vehicles staggered, different routes, the city waking slowly around them as they moved back through it. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, not dramatically, not with the cinematic announcement of sunrise, but with the gradual, honest gray of a morning arriving because it was morning's time, regardless of what the night had been. Nia sat in the back of the second vehicle and watched it come. Minjae sat beside her and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the silence between them was different from the silences of earlier in the night. Not the silence of strangers managing proximity, not the silence of people in the middle of something urgent. Just the silence of two people who were very tired and had been through the same thing and didn't need to explain it to each other. His hand was on the seat between them. She looked at it, the wrapped cloth, the knuckles that would be bruised under the bandage. She turned her own hand over beside it, and after a moment his fingers found hers, and neither of them commented on it. They were back in the penthouse as the sun broke the horizon. The full daylight, when it came, was without mercy. It illuminated everything the night had done to the space. The medical supplies on the table, the tablet with the network diagram still open, the chair where Minji had sat while she dressed his wound, the dark stain on the cushion that they'd both been carefully not looking at since they came back in. Evidence of a night that had been many things, none of them small. Minjae went to the kitchen and made coffee with the specific, focused attention of a man who needs something simple to do with his hands. She watched him from across the room and thought about how completely strange it was that this was what he looked like when the composure was down. Not broken, not diminished, just human. Moving around a kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, making coffee because the night was over and the body required something ordinary. He brought 2 cups to the low table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and they drank coffee in the full light of the morning and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "What happened to Su-yeon? Tell me the actual story." He looked at her over the cup. She held the look and didn't qualify the request. He set the cup down. Looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "She was 22. I was 29. I'd been in the organization for 6 years, had built enough of a name that I was visible. The kind of visible that meant people in this industry took me seriously. I thought serious meant safe. I thought if I was strong enough, the threat was directed at me, and the people I cared about were incidental." He stopped. "I was wrong about that in a very specific way. They went after her to get to you. They went after her to show me what serious actually meant. Not a threat against me. A demonstration. Something that said, you are not large enough to protect what you love, and you never will be." He said it without inflection. Just the shape of it, stated plainly. She was coming home from a studio visit. She'd been working on a collection. She was designing furniture. She had this specific aesthetic, very clean lines, very structural. She talked about it every time we spoke. His jaw tightened slightly. Released. They put her in the hospital first. She survived that. And then she didn't. He picked up the cup again. She died 3 weeks later. Complications. That's the word the doctors used. The morning light was full and clear and did nothing to soften anything. "I identified the people responsible," he said. "I dealt with that. And then I spent the next 5 years building something that could not be threatened in the same way again. An organization that ran on structure rather than loyalty, because loyalty required people to be real to you, and real things could be taken." He looked at Nia directly. "That was the theory. And tonight revised the theory. Tonight demonstrated that the theory had a flaw." He set the cup down again. "You cannot actually build something that cannot be threatened. You can only decide what the threat is worth. And for 5 years I decided that nothing was worth the specific vulnerability of—" He stopped. "Caring." She held his gaze. She said, "That's a very expensive way to be safe." "Yes," he said. "It is." She nodded. She thought about her own version of it, the ocean she'd crossed, the life she'd built from careful, controlled components, the specific pride of not needing anyone to do something on her behalf. She thought about Trevor's face at the ballroom, the way she'd braced for the humiliation and told herself she could take it alone. The way the word wife from a stranger's mouth had produced, underneath all the shock and confusion, something that felt unmistakably like relief, and how much she'd resented the relief, and what that resentment had been protecting. She said, "I came to Tokyo because I wanted to build something that was mine. Not mine and someone else's. Not mine contingent on someone else's presence. Just mine, clean and complete, and not dependent on anyone's decision but my own." She looked at the city in the window, the full morning version of it, all that structured light and movement and indifferent scale. "And I built it. I did. The job, the apartment, the life. 2 years of it." She paused. And then last night, a man put his hand on my back in a ballroom and said 4 words. And I spent the next 12 hours walking directly toward every dangerous thing in my immediate vicinity, and my hands didn't shake once. Minja was very still. That tells me something about what the quiet life was protecting, she said, and what it wasn't. He looked at her with the full unguarded version of whatever he was, and she saw it clearly, finally, for the first time without the composure in the way of it. A man who was genuinely formidable and genuinely alone, who had made himself that way with tremendous effort and considerable cost, who had stood in a ballroom 8 seconds ahead of a decision and stepped into it anyway, and who was now sitting across from her in the full morning light with coffee in a wrapped hand, and the specific vulnerability of a person who has said true things out loud and cannot take them back. She said, "The marriage. We need to talk about what that actually is." He said, "Yes. Because what you announced in that ballroom was a contract, a utility, and what last night was, what it became, is something else. And those two things need to be the same thing, or this doesn't work." "What would make them the same thing?" he said, and the question was asked with complete seriousness, without deflection, without any of the strategic maneuvering she'd watched him apply to every other problem of the night. She said, "Honesty. About what this is and what it isn't. About what your world requires and what mine requires. About the fact that I am not going to disappear into the architecture of your organization, and I am not going to stop being the person I built myself into just because the circumstances changed." She held the look. "And in exchange, I don't run from the shape of your world. I don't pretend it's something other than what it is. And when you make a decision that affects me, you make it with me, not for me." I was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the morning light shifted slightly, moved across the table, between them. "Those are fair terms," he said. "They're not terms," she said. Terms are for contracts. This is just what it has to be, if it's going to be anything." He looked at her, and what was in his expression then was not the closeness she'd expected from the warmth of the almost smile, not the dramatic arrival of something that announced itself. It was quieter and realer than that. The specific quality of a person who has been alone in a very particular way for a very long time, and is, slowly, with full awareness of the cost of the prior aloneness, allowing themselves to be less so. He said, "Nia." She said, "Yes. I'm going to need some time to be worse at this than I want to be." She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close, and he saw it, and his expression shifted accordingly, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was the first genuinely light thing that had existed in the room since before the gala, small and warm and entirely unplanned. "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to practice that." She picked up her coffee cup, looked at the city, thought about the next week, the things that would need to be resolved, the 4 names and the Kuroda organization's recalculation, and the specific work of dismantling a 2-year infiltration of Min Jae's structure. Thought about her own work, her translation firm, the professional world she'd built that would now be adjacent to his in ways she'd have to navigate carefully. Thought about Ji-yeon's face from across the gala ballroom, the wide-eyed alarm, the message she'd definitely sent to Nia's phone sometime in the past several hours that Nia had not yet read. Thought about all of it, the full, complex, inconvenient, costly shape of what the night had produced, and found that she could hold it without wanting to put it down. That was new information about herself. Dai Jung came in briefly, set a folded document on the table near Min Jae with the quiet efficiency of a man completing a final item on a list, and left without speaking. Min Jae looked at it without picking it up. Nia looked at it too. A single sheet, dense with text, the Kuroda organization's name visible in the first line. "The arithmetic," she said. "The arithmetic," he confirmed. He picked it up, read it with the focused, complete attention he brought to everything, set it down, made one call, very short, in Korean. Set the phone face down on the table beside the document, and then he sat back and did something she hadn't seen him do all night. He exhaled. Not dramatically, not with the release of something performed, just a slow breath out through his nose that was the most human sound she'd heard from him, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she watched him do it, and she understood that what she was seeing was the actual person, the one underneath the legend, underneath the 5 years of deliberate construction, underneath the composure that had become so practiced it looked like nature. He looked like a tired man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had, in the past 12 hours, set down the part of it he could set down. He looked at her. "How is your arm?" "The cut." She'd forgotten about it entirely. She looked at the dressing, still in place, still clean at the edges. Fine, she said. It should be looked at properly. It's fine, Minji. Still, she looked at him. He was looking at her with the specific quality of attention of a person who is going to be, for the foreseeable future, somewhat more careful about the physical condition of the people he is near than is strictly efficient. She understood this. She thought she could probably live with it. Later, she said, he accepted that. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The morning continued its unhurried arrival across the skyline, the light changing from gray to the clear gold of a late October morning, the city below filling gradually with the ordinary sound and movement of a million people, beginning a day that had no knowledge of the night they'd just survived. The contract on the table between them was not the real thing. She'd known that for hours. The real thing had no document. It had a hand at the small of her back in a ballroom, and glass falling from her hair onto a parking structure floor, and the specific steadiness of her hands over a wound in a chair, and a shot that went wide because she'd moved before she'd thought about moving. It had 4 words spoken in a crowded room, and everything that had grown in the soil of those 4 words through a single long night. It had this: 2 people at a table in the morning light, coffee going cold. The city spread out before them in all its indifferent scale. The specific quiet of something that had been decided not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of 100 small ones, each one chosen, each one real, none of them easy. She thought about what she would tell Ji-yeon. She thought about her apartment in Shimokitazawa, the books on the shelf, the specific morning light through her kitchen window. She thought about the translation work waiting for her, the quarterly communications brief, the conference in November, the ordinary professional life that would continue being hers. She thought about a man who had said, "She is my wife," with the complete certainty of something he'd decided in 8 seconds, and who had been right about it in a way neither of them had understood at the time. She thought, this city is very large and very old and has seen everything. It has seen 1,000 versions of this. 2 people finding each other in the worst possible circumstances and deciding, against all reasonable advice, that the finding was worth the circumstances. She thought, I crossed an ocean to build something mine. I did that. And now the thing that's mine is larger than I planned for, and more complicated, and costs more to hold than the quiet version did. And my hands are still steady. Min-jae set his cup down and looked at the city for a moment, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching arrive all night, the one that had been underneath everything, working its way up through 5 years of careful construction, arriving finally in the full light of the morning without apology and without announcement. He said, "Thank you." She knew he didn't mean just last night. She knew he meant all of it, the 4 minutes in a room with Trevor, and the phone call to Maury, and the warehouse floor, and the medical kit and the gauze, and the honest words at a waterfront at 4 in the morning. He meant the decision to stay when every reasonable instinct said to go. He meant the steady hands. She said, "Don't thank me yet. We're just getting started." He looked at her for a long moment, and the corner of his mouth moved. And this time it completed itself. The architecture of it, small and unguarded and entirely his own. "Yes," he said. "We are." Outside, Tokyo continued its morning in full, beautiful, indifferent earnest. The light on the water, the traffic on the elevated expressways, the 10 million lives moving through their separate urgencies. The city that had been a battlefield 6 hours ago was a city again. The night was over. The ledger of it would take time to close, the names, the Kuroda organization's recalculation, the long work of rebuilding a structure that had been compromised from the inside for 2 years. None of that was small. None of it was finished. But the 2 people at the table in the penthouse overlooking all of it were finished with something, the particular kind of alone they had each, separately, been building for years. The kind that looked like strength from the outside and felt, from the inside, like a room with no windows. They were done with that room. What came next would be difficult and uncertain, and would cost them things they couldn't yet name. It would be, in every way that mattered, entirely their choice. That was enough. For now, in this morning light, with the coffee going cold and the city below them moving through its ordinary miracle of another day. That was exactly enough.